In this video, I'm going to explain the different Cherry MX switches, the red, blue, brown, white, and silent red. Why do so many people love Cherry MX switches? Part of that has to do with their popularity. Everybody knows about Cherry because they're the first manufacturer of the mechanical switch, and this means they have the most experience. Since they've been in the game for so long, they've mastered their craft and they're able to create long-lasting switches that are reliable, each one built with the quality in mind. They also came up with many styles of switches, each one with a different actuation force, tactile feel, and more. A lot of high-end mechanical keyboards feature the Cherry MX switch, and there are some switches that try to be like Cherry, but they fall short. Now let's have a bit of some backstory and history. In 1953, the Cherry Corporation Company was founded in the USA, but they didn't start producing mechanical keyboards until 20 years later. Since then, the Cherry has been in the keyboard production business longer than any other company. But in 1979, the company was sold, but still, they continue to design and manufacture all sorts of keyboard and switches from a German region called Auerbach in der Oberpfalz. In the 1980s, Cherry came out with that Cherry MX switch, though this isn't just one switch, rather it's a line of switches that continues to grow. Each one is named after its color, for example, Cherry MX Red, Cherry MX Blue, Cherry MX Brown, Cherry MX White, and so on. They also have some specialized switches. For example, the Cherry MX Super Black is best used on the spacebar, while the Cherry MX Lock was intended to be used as a caps lock key. Now let's go to the key switch terminology. Each switch has a different attribute and they're based on different factors. For example, when comparing Cherry MX switches, we usually look at tactile versus linear versus clicky. We also look at their actuation force. Now, tactile versus linear versus clicky. Tactile switches have a bump and they provide feedback when you type on them. These switches are quiet compared to others, and when you press on these switches, you'll feel the tactile bump around the middle of the keystroke. This switch is great for typing or gaming alike. You can feel when the key has been pressed without the loud clicky noise that may annoy others around you. The most common tactile switch in the Cherry lineup is the Cherry MX Browns. Now for the linear switches. Linear switches are exactly as it sounds, as they feature a linear mechanism. There's no bump or click as these switches move up and down. It's just one smooth movement. These switches are mostly preferred by gamers. The smoothness helps with quick keystrokes in order to perform different combos within the game. The most common linear switch in the Cherry lineup is the Cherry MX Reds. Now for the clicky switches. Clicky switches are similar to tactile switches in that they offer a tactile bump. However, these switches also come with audio feedback. This is known as the click and how they got their name. When someone says mechanical keyboard, this is generally what you may think about. If you love the clicky sound, this is what you're looking for. The most common clicky switch in the Cherry lineup is the Cherry MX Blues. What is the actuation force? The actuation force is determined by the required energy to actuate any given key. In the Cherry lineup, they cover a huge range. This includes switches that require the slightest touch, all the way to switches needing your whole body weight to press it down. Well, not really, but it seems like it. So when it comes to Cherry MX switches, their most common switches fall within the 45 to 60 grams force range. However, they do have some specialized switches that are a lot harder to press. These switches are in the 150 gram range and are usually used on the spacebar, caps lock, etc. Now check the article out, which is the link in the description for a complete table of every Cherry MX switch and their stats, including actuation force and what they're best used for. Also in the article is a sound test of every Cherry MX switch, so check it out. The most common Cherry MX switches overview. Let's look at the Cherry MX Red. Cherry MX Red switches are a linear switch, and they're usually used by gamers because they're easy to press keys very quickly with no resistance. Since these switches have no tactile bump or click, they aren't recommended for typing as there's no feedback to let you know that you have actuated the key. The distance of these switches is 4 millimeters with an actual point at 2 millimeters. They are very light to press, requiring only 45 grams of force. The thing that brings a lot of people to choose this keyboard is the quietness, depending on where you plan on using your keyboard. You may find it very useful to be able to use it without annoying the people around you. Now for the Cherry MX Black. Cherry MX Blacks are a linear switch, but they are just heavier. However, the actuation force of these switches is much higher than the Reds, and the distance of these switches is 4 millimeters with an actuation point at 2 millimeters. They are very heavy to press, requiring about 60 grams of force. These keys tend to get heavier as they close to bottoming out. It may be hard to use these switches for a long time without your fingers cramping and tiring out. These switches are basically a combination of the Reds and the Blues, having the linear traits of the Reds and the heaviness of the Blues. Cherry MX Brown. Cherry MX Browns are both quiet and tactile, and many consider them the best of both worlds as they have that tactile feedback without the annoying clicking of a clicky switch. Like other Cherry MX switches, they have a travel distance of 4 millimeters with an actuation point at 2 millimeters, and these are relatively light switches, requiring 45 grams of force. If you're a typing enthusiast and a gamer, but you only have budget for one keyboard or key switch, then this might be a good choice. They're not the best choice for either one, but a great choice for a multi-purpose switch. Now for the Cherry MX Blue. They're very loud and clicky, and they have a travel distance of 4 millimeters and actuation at 2 millimeters. These are heavier than other switches and require 50 grams of force. They're typically what you think of when you think of a mechanical keyboard. I won't recommend them if you're using the keyboard in a work setting with others around you. The sound travels and is sure to annoy your coworkers. If you insist on having this switch and you already purchased it, you can try to utilize O-rings. They may not completely eliminate the sound, but they will reduce it slightly. Now, which Cherry MX switch is the best? It mostly comes down to personal preference. Though some switches were created with a certain activity in mind, it's not set in stone. What's the best for gaming? The black and red switches in the Cherry lineup are geared towards gamers. It's because they're linear switches, and they have no tactile bump or click. Each keystroke is one smooth action which allows gamers to press the keys much faster due to less resistance. The red switch has a lower actuation force at 45 grams. The black is the same switch, just heavier at 60 grams. If you're a gamer that tends to slam on the keys, you may prefer the black switch. But if you're pretty easy with a keyboard, the red may be a better fit. What's the best for typists? The Cherry MX switch for a typist is arguably the blue switch in the Cherry lineup. It's because they offer a tactile bump and an audible click sound. These combined make it super productive while typing, and it may cause a lot fewer errors. These switches also don't have to bottom out to actuate, which means it puts a less strain on your fingers and allows you to type much faster. What's best for both? Overall, it's probably the brown switch. It's a versatile switch that can be used for both gaming and typing. It's a combination of the first two mentioned. It has a tactile bump similar to the blue switch, but there's no click sound similar to the red and black switch. This switch is great if you do a lot of work or school on your computer, but you also play video games. It's also great in a busy work environment since it's quieter than the blues. The blues can become quite distracting, especially with the room full of people typing. Choosing the right switch. When choosing a switch, it comes down to personal preference. With all these choices, it's hard to narrow down what you really want. One way to help narrow things down is with an MX Cherry Key Tester, which is the link on the description. Being able to try out all the keys for yourself and compare them side by side is the best way to make your decision. A mechanical keyboard is an expensive purchase, so investing a couple of bucks in a tester is a no-brainer. Frequently asked questions about Cherry MX switches. Which Cherry MX switch is the quietest? The quietest is the silent red switch. It's a pink-colored switch, and it's basically the same as the red, but with a rubber dampener inside. The bad thing about this switch is that they're not very common and they may be hard to find. Which Cherry MX switch is the clickiest? It's definitely the blue switch. It's a great switch to have, very high quality, and has both types of feedback, both the tactile bump and the click sound. However, some may say that the blue switch is too loud and may regret purchasing it. It's a good idea to test one out for yourself before committing to it. How long do Cherry MX switches last? It definitely lasts a long time. Some people claim they may last over 100 million keystrokes. Most of the other switches on the market only last about 50 million keystrokes or less. That's why it makes sense to buy a Cherry switch. It costs more, but it also lasts longer. We're looking at about 10 to 20 years before these switches wear out, compared to a rubber dome keyboard, which may last about 2 to 3 years if you're lucky. Are Cherry MX speed switches good for typing? This is a strong debate, whether they are actually good for typing. The way these were designed was for the sole purpose of being fast. The company achieved this by adjusting the actuation point to 1.2 millimeters rather than 2 millimeters like most other switches. In theory, you should be able to actuate the key a lot faster. However, the main problem is that this is a linear switch similar to the red switch. Because of the lack of feedback, you may think you pressed a key when you didn't. So it may be faster, but you also may see more errors. Are Cherry MX red switches good for gaming? It is arguably the best switch for gaming. This is what it was designed for. The smooth key presses allow you to mash the buttons very quickly with little resistance. The quietness is also preferred for streamers, YouTubers, or just people who like to use a mic to chat with other players. If you've never been in a game chat with someone using a Cherry MX blue switch, then you'll understand and appreciate the red switches a lot more. Is Cherry MX blue bad for gaming? I would say yes. It is pretty bad for gaming. But that's a personal preference and some may disagree. Some people, they love using blue switches while they're gaming. The tactile feedback and click sound are enjoyable for them. However, it might make gaming a bit harder. Not to mention, if you're playing with other players, you will absolutely annoy them. If you want a similar experience to the Cherry MX Blues, but a bit less annoying, I say go for the Cherry MX Browns. They're very well-rounded switch, and it's hard to go wrong with it. What is the fastest Cherry MX switch? The fastest is probably the silver switch, also called the MX speed switch, although it's debatable and you may be sacrificing accuracy for speed. It's like being able to run faster, but you trip all the time. Is it worth it? That's up to you. Are Cherry MX red switches clicky? Not really. Every switch will have some sound as you bottom out the key. However, this switch was designed to be as quiet as possible. If you get the switch and you're unhappy with how loud it is, consider adding O-rings to the switch for an almost silent keyboard. You could also check out the less common silent red switch, which has rubber dampening. They are rarer and probably not much quieter than a red switch with O-rings. Can you switch Cherry MX switches? Yes, you can. And it depends on the keyboard, which will determine how hard or easy this task is. Changing a switch is super simple. You can just pop it out and put a new one in. But if your keyboard is PCB mounted or plate mounted, then it will be a bit more work. You'll need a few tools and knowledge to desolder the old switches and solder the new ones on. It's a bit complicated, so I recommend you to look up how to do it on YouTube. There are plenty of guides out there. What is the difference between Gateron and Cherry? There are a few differences, and you can see it in another article on Keyboard Kings. But the quick answer is that Gateron is a very close competitor to Cherry, with their linear switches actually being better. If you're a gamer, you may want to look at Gateron switches. But the downside is they won't last as long as a Cherry switch, but they are less expensive, and some say it's worth the sacrifice. It's still a 5 to 10 year lifespan, so that's quite a long time. In conclusion, Cherry MX switches are definitely the dominant switch company, with Gateron being a very close second and perhaps dominating the linear switch aspect. Though there are many great switches in the Cherry MX lineup, it may be difficult to choose one for you. The best thing to do is to go to a store and try them all out, or get the switch tester I mentioned earlier in this article. When deciding on a switch, there will be a few questions you may want to consider. Are you mostly going to use your keyboard for typing, or gaming, or both? Do you enjoy the clicking sounds while pressing the keys? Do you type lightly, or do you slam the keys until they bottom out? Do you like the tactile feedback when typing? There are tons of switches out there from different manufacturers, and this is a basic overlook of the most common types of switches that Cherry MX offers. There are many switches available, but this one only looked at the Cherry MX lineup, which is arguably the best, so going with Cherry is probably your best bet. I hope this article helps you in some way, and if you're still unsure about which switch to get or what keyboard to buy, there are plenty more resources available on the website. So have a look around, and if you have any questions, visit the Contact Me page. Check out Keyboard Kings. For more guides and reviews, go to my website keyboardkings.com. Thank you. A link to this article will be in the description box below.